For the first time, Americans today are not free to say what they think. If they say something deemed offensive or insensitive or, worst of all, hate speech, they may be in serious trouble. They may be punished for violating the unholy commandments of the 90s, commonly known as political correctness. But is political correctness a new phenomenon? We'll show you tonight that political correctness has been in the making for more than 8 decades. And it seems that a deteriorating society is exactly what political correctness strives for. But just what is political correctness? As you're about to see, political correctness is nothing less than a Marxist ideology.
That was William Lind, who, along with Paul Weyrich, leader of the Heritage, or one of the co-founders of the Heritage Foundation, helped the right transition from being explicitly segregationist to making it about things like religious liberty and freedom of speech.
Mm-hmm.
A complaint that is, we're hearing it a lot now, but I think something that I want to stress is that this is not. It's not anything new. This is not even from the 90s. This is not even like, this is even before the cultural Marxist, which Lind really hates, of the Frankfurt School. This goes before then. Let's start with a little guy named Charles Murray. Charles Murray is folks don't know, along with another guy who died when Murray was doing all the press, Herrnstein or something like that, author of a book called The Bell Curve, which purported to show that there's innate intelligence tied to race, that mean that there's nothing we can do with regards to, like, say, black people in this country, that they're where they are at cognitively, and it's not the product of anything to do with society. It's all to do with their genetics. We'll debunk this we'll debunk this right now. So this came up. Charles Murray has sort of moved on into this sort of, following the bell curve. He wrote a book called Losing Ground, which is basically a similar sort of thing, but just about poor whites, which is instead of genetics, poor whites have sort of a cultural problem that is keeping them behind. Again, he's basically just naturalizing inequality that you experience in a capitalist society.
No, I mean, I was just going to say that, like, this becomes really big in like the 80s and in particular in the 90s as a way for conservatives to be able to talk about the problem of poverty that most people were recognizing was happening. And, like, of course, they don't like things like social programs that help people who are dealing with poverty. And they certainly don't want to turn their attention at the actual systems and the causes of poverty, which is a system of like hyper exploitation named capitalism. So they start cooking up these theories that, you know, it's the decline in the family structure, right? It's the decline in the cultural norms, right? Music is celebrating like gang violence and, you know, criminal behavior. So that's why these people are sort of stuck in poverty, and not the fact that people are put into, you know, positions because of the needs of this kind of productive monster that we have under like American capitalism, right? This kind of hyper focus is like, oh, it's culture, right? And you see like that's the negative side of it, right, Matt? But you can see that like the other side of that ideology, you see that now with like the kind of like TikTok finance hustlers, right? Like the thing that's keeping you down is that like you don't have a rise and grind mentality. And, you know, if you buy my Bitcoin, or if you like find a way to own a small family home and become a landlord, then you're going to be rich, just like all of the other rich folks, right? So like that, you know, those are two sides of the same kind of argument about like why there is poverty in a country like the United States of America.
Yeah, I mean, they're really just so stories. Like, we have a term for this stuff. It's like explanations that seem like they're sort of a plausible, maybe when considered in absence of anything else. Like, okay, maybe that's the case. And Charles Murray is still on his shit now.
I love this
Saying,
one.
I mean, it's probably a bit too convoluted to get into, but they're talking about something called cold winters theory. Charles Murray jumps in. To me, the core truth of the cold winters theory is this: humans in places where temperatures get lethally cold all die 100% unless they figure out ways to stay warm. There's no other comparably ruthless environmental demand. So this is like,
Which is like
Yeah,
historically is wild too, right?
I mean,
You know,
ridiculous.
y'all remember when you do your like world history, like in elementary school, you studied like the Indus Valley civilizations, not the Scandinavian like mega civilizations, right? There's
Right?
like,
Yes.
you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
there's a part of the world where
Babylon.
like civilization really thrived, and was very advanced. And there's parts of the world where it was very, very disorganized for a long time, right? And so this argument that like the literal environment is what's shaping cultures versus like actual conditions in the way that systems and societies are set up to produce goods for use, right? It's just like it's the most like bizarre Reddit brain kind of thing. And like, you know, I don't even want to use Reddit brain because obviously that's like a very particular group of people, right? This is like central to a lot of American conservative thought.
Yeah.
um
And so I want to play this clip of Hitchens because there's this article he wrote which accurately predicts that this is the sort of bullshit that they be talking about as sun people and ice people. But there's this clip from this panel. It's available on C-SPAN. Very interesting panel with Hitchens and some other folks. Mark Crispin Miller and Walter Isaacson go back and forth. Crispin Miller, more of an independent journalist type. Walter Isaacson, the Time editor. Hitchens is there really holding it down. I think very interesting. This full thing is actually very interesting because it's at a time before all this independent media has developed, and they're talking about like how you decide on what things to write. And what I like about this is Hitchens will dispense entirely with Murray's arguments here. But he also says something that I think is important, and I think we're guilty of on the left, which is to say, like, oh, yeah, you can't trust anything from the mainstream media. That's not actually the message. The message is that it's all biased in a certain way, in particular in terms of like capital empire. But we've gotten a little bit too far in like the whole distrust everything you see with your eyes
Totally.
sort of thing, which it gets a little bit like if you watch the Nexium documentaries, it's a little bit cult literally. More charitably, it's about, I'm the brand you can come to and give your attention and dollars to because I'm the only trustworthy one. And I just appreciate, I wanted to include the start of this because I think Hitchens makes this point nicely.
Look, there is no shortage of information in this country. You can find out anything you want, including what firm exploits who, and you can find it through the mass media if you wish. I hope we really are not under any illusion about what we're talking about here. We are drowning in information. The question is not what you think, but how you think. If I may recur to it. For example, have you ever seen, however, a story about Cuba, no matter what it said, where the lead was not, will this country, this island nation, become, or will it not become, more friendly to American interests after all this time? That is the line of the day. A reporter who doesn't write about Cuba in that respect won't write about Cuba at all. Take Farai's very good point about Charles Murray. I was the first person, I think I can say, in fact I know I was the first person to debate publicly with Charles Murray on the bell curve. I was very, very keen that book got wide publicity. And I was sad that our debate didn't get as much as it could have done, because it is either true, according to these findings and others, it's either true that there's a great deal of race and class subordination going on in America to create an underclass, or it is true that the abused and much inseminated descendants of our former domestic servants are stupid, okay? One or other of these things must be true on the findings. And it's a very interesting discussion indeed, and it was very good for Murray to bring it up. Did you read one story?
Now, before we get to this part, I just want to say there are people on Reddit who are confused by this. They seem like he seems to be encouraging Murray. And Hitchens is a very ironic person. It should have been clear in the way he set this up, saying, on the one hand, there might be a lot of race and class subordination created in an underclass. That is what Hitchens himself believes, and that's why he welcomes that conversation. As opposed to, say, the much abused and, as Hitchens, of course, says, inseminated because of, if you're going to talk about genetics, you got to talk about crossbreeding with the fucking master class, right? With American black people in the slave population. But then this is the point that he makes here, which I appreciate the way he clocks this, which is like how you are in fact able to write about this stuff.
Stupid, okay? One or other of these things must be true on the findings. And it's a very interesting discussion indeed, and it was very good for Murray to bring it up. Did you read one story? that did not say that here is Mr. Murray and the late Professor Herrnstein, line of the day, first paragraph, introduction paragraph, without which the story could not be written or published, at last breaking the taboo of political correctness on this subject.
Absolutely
Then you
true.
can write about the bell curve. Then you can write about race and class. Then you can do it. It's not what you know or what you think, it's how you think and how you know what you know. It's about the construction of knowledge.
Do you think?
Yeah.
I mean, and really, like, we see this over and over again. I want to stay on this bell curve just for the folks on the Sam Harris subreddit who weren't entirely sure which side of the IQ debate Hitchens comes down on. This is one of his best succinct columns. Like, if this was your job for the week, like, this is Hitchens nailing it here. I'll just read a little bit from the first paragraph. There is, and there always has been, an unusually high and consistent correlation between the stupidity of a given person and that person's propensity to be impressed by the measurement of IQ. What is not the boys? Was it not the boy in the back of the class, that prognathous dolt, who, removing grimy digit from well-excavated nostril, the better to breathe through his mouth, would opine, "They're not as intelligent as us, been proved in it scientific." Let's just go a little bit to the science, because there's stuff, and I'd recommend, we sort of dealt with this in a video that was on TMBS that's up on the Majority Report YouTube channel called "Sam Harris Lights His Career on Fire." That goes into some of the more recent IQ stuff, but it hasn't really changed much since Hitchens was talking to this scientist here. Dr. William Hazeltine, who runs Human Genome Sciences Inc. This concern is by at least 5 blah blah blah. His firm has recently identified the genes that predispose humans to colonic, ovarian, and uterine cancers. We have gone in a relatively short time from identifying about 2% of the human genes to more than 50%. That's 2,000, 3,000 to 60 to 70,000, and there are probably not more than 100,000. If the system is a transistor, we have gone from analyzing circuit boards to breaking down its components, and only 1/4% of our basic genetic information can be ascribed to what we call racial differences. It is a difference between individuals that are enormous and becoming better known. There are almost 15 million changes in the genetic code between one human and another. Now, this at this remove, this should be obvious to people at how artificial race was. But let's just go a little bit further. In other words, scientific advance confirms that there is only one human, quote, race, and that the individual possesses fantastic complexity and variety. But pseudoscience persists in its petty quest for the elusive G-spot of quantifiable intelligence. And the result of the latter practice is that individuals become subsumed into lumpish, arbitrary categories. And the conservatives want to take credit for the brilliance of the second option. Let them have, quote, the ice people and the, quote, sun people. Hitchens wrote this in 1994. This is still what fucking Charles Murray is doing. And all the rest of the rubbish, while the left emancipates itself from all versions of ethnicity and concentrates on what it should have never forgotten, what Gramsci called the project of the whole man. All societies that have tried to keep themselves pure from the Confucian Chinese through the Castilian Spanish to the post-Wilhelmine Germans will have collapsed into barbarianism, insularity, and superstition. And swiftly enough for us to be certain that the fall was no more connected to the genes than was the rise. And this is the key point. And this is as well put as, like, you were talking about Stephen Jay Gould with Kevin Bird, but this is so well put. There is no gene for IQ, and there is no genetic or evolutionary timing that is short enough to explain histories or societies.
And I think that's the fundamental point right there. And, like, you know, just for people who want to continue, like, exploring and learning on this too, I highly suggest reading the Field Sisters, you know, classic work, Racecraft, which also really breaks these things down. And, like, the right has embraced them, and they are, you know, these tired ideas that have been debunked scientifically time and time again live and thrive in the space where the Sam Harrises and the Weinstein brothers or whatever say, we're the only ones, we're the only rational, reasonable people who are willing to have these conversations, because the woke mob, we're back in the 90s, the politically correct folks won't allow us to do this, right? You know, time and time again, this has been just absolutely debunked. this idea that like there is like this genetic racial difference across a lot of things, but in particular in the case that they're trying to argue about in the level of intelligence of people. IQ as a measurement is something that is highly flawed. In fact, people recognize it was flawed back in 1905. This isn't something that like later, in like society, we realized was a big problem. Back then, people were criticizing and saying like, oh, this is probably not a great way to measure or treat as like an objective measurement of intelligence within people, right?
Yeah.
It measures particular things, particular skills. The testing, as people know, has biases, and you're going to have certain advantages depending on culture and all these other things that aren't reflected in like your actual intelligence, but more so in your ability to present in a way that is going to be reflected on these kind of tests. And of course, again, this is not new information, but it's something that like has held the mind and like the imagination of a certain section of the right for a long time. And I think because like there is this kind of general tendency, I think, in humans in general to want to be able to take complex, difficult things and be able to boil them down to a number, right? I'm 102, right? Or I'm 123, or you're 145, right? Like people want to be able to have that kind of measurement instead of recognizing that like intelligence is a very, very complicated and fraught thing to be able to measure or understand in any metric.
Yeah. And I also just want to underline like Hitchens is like relishing, like when he says like he's glad Murray brought it up. Like that's it. And he says, indeed, it's an important conversation to have because that stuff about the class oppression is important to talk to. If we don't talk about that stuff, the Charles Murray sort of naturalization thing kind of runs on its own course. And so like, I mean, that's why like actually elsewhere in that talk, which we'll link to, Hitchens basically says like, this is why you give them an argument, right? Like you need to be there. And I don't know if you have more to say on Hitchens here, but I do want to widen the scope 100 years to, and we'll start with, this is from a book by Fayette Hall called The Copperhead, or The Secret Political History of the Civil War Unveiled.
Ooh.
And it sounds very interesting. And I'll just cut to the chase here. Cut to the shot before we get to the or the chase before we get to the shot. But this is what this person has for us. So the New York World of the above date gave illustrations of a series of 7 heads from man-like ape to ape-like man, up to the high intelligence. This ape-like man is second in the list. It was intended as a companion portrait to Mr. Lincoln's to show the similarity of the two brains, but our printer, being a Republican and a gentleman of sensitive, fine sentiment, read PMC, thinking it might have been taken as a caricature, wished to be excused from printing it, to which, to spare his feelings, we cheerfully consented. And well, I'll just go a little bit. Here's like what they're comparing it to. Look at, that's proof Lincoln is phrenologically less than. But what's more interesting to me is all the fucking preface that I had to read to get to this part of this book, which is, the man who knows the truth and fears to declare it is a coward, but he who should suppress the truth with free speech should defend it through fear and conflicting. It's all this stuff about basically the woke mob. Here's a little bit more phrenology. Here's a little bit more. There's a Thomas Paine quote: "The liberty of the press, it is like the air we breathe. If we have it not, we die." And it was from the teaching of Thomas Paine and his sympathizers in this country, that the author of the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, that the inspiration came to embed the federal state, blah, blah, the provision that we must speak freely. And just one more that I think is the best. That any person or speaker who exposes facts or expresses an opinion at variance with their assumption, arrogance, and dictation shall be suppressed by mob violence or any other means necessary to crush out free speech. None but the guilty or cowards fear the truth. So, like, what I'm saying is, like, look, I think free speech is massively important. When I traveled to London looking for an internship in 2011, I wanted to work for Index on Censorship. I think that sort of mission is extremely valuable. I think American free speech is better than, say, for instance, China. Right? Nonetheless, this has been a vehicle for so fucking long, and it's the exact same thing of hiding the ball. And Hitchens is exactly right. We're only going to be able to discuss these sorts of things as if it's in the context of like, oh, this is a full populism. Hitchens goes on of a elitism masquerading as populism. And that's what this is of like, oh, now we're allowed to talk about it, but through the guise of actually maybe these hierarchies are genetically determined. And it's the exact same way when we have conversations about like COVID, for instance, and what's allowed and not allowed, disallowed to be said. On the one hand, it's the Joe Biden, like we keep people back together, but we take the vax. On the other hand, it's this corporate authoritarianism, maybe like in bed with China, to like take away our bodily autonomy. And like, so that's the point I want to make, is just be aware of the vehicles that certain people are using.
Well, I mean that and also that fundamental to the project of the right has been trying to naturalize the human created order of capitalism, right?
Mhm.
And what the Murrays do, what the Sam Harrises do, is recognize the fact that there's social inequity in American society. But rather than doing what like a Marxist or somebody who uses a materialist analysis, somebody who actually like studies the way that things work, right? The actual like real production, the real way that society functions, the real way that we interact with one another because of the system that we're living under. They naturalize it, right? So instead of it being, oh, well, no, the American system has purposefully worked to create an underclass, purposefully worked to create people who are desperate enough so that they can be the grease on the wheels that keep the system going, right? Rather, no, it's actually just like some of these people are stupid and there's nothing you can do about it. And if you think that there's something you should do about it, you're just being a wishy-washy, hopeful, idealist liberal, right? I mean, that's
Yep.
fundamental to the worldview and the arguments that's put forward through all these people, because like it's not scientific. It's something that again gets debunked time and time again. Again, I highly suggest that people want like a more in-depth like breakdown about these things. We had Kevin Bird on the program. There's a link below in the show notes on YouTube for people to be able to watch that interview about the way that the right has tried to sort of present themselves as like the defenders of science, the defenders of truth. And in reality, these are people who are operating on the extreme fringes and outside of like the scientific community at large, right? But I think it's also important, Matt, to like look, as you were just doing with that pamphlet, um, from the 1800s, is seeing too that this whole idea that like society was at one time like hyper reactionary, and then over time like we started to learn, right? And then got better. Back in the 1800s, these people were saying they were being silenced for speaking the truth about for speaking the truth about like races and intelligence and all of that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
Like in the 1800s, they were saying we're being silenced by the woke mob, basically, in the
Right.
same way that they're
Fucking
saying in
Jim Crow.
2023.
Yeah, like that motherfucker. First of all, that book was published in Connecticut. Like, I'm not sure
Oh,
if
sorry, I
the
didn't know
publishing,
that.
yeah, right. Like, I'm not sure if the publishing houses in the South were so like open to like anti-Confederate stuff during like fucking Jim Crow. I doubt it. Right? And so it's like
Oh no,
you're
yeah, yeah,
invoking,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
right? Like you're invoking like Tom Paine, and you're saying all this shit about like, which is true about free speech, and you don't say like, oh, by the way, yeah, that fucking racial sort of like slavocracy is sort of reforming itself as like a Jim Crow sort of oligarchy. Maybe we should like look at that a little bit. No, that stuff, there's like hundreds of lynchings this year, but it's that the fucking New York Herald won't publish this phrenology about Lincoln.
And look, there's a lot of stuff I suggest people check out. A personal favorite of mine, to look at like this ideology and sort of challenging a lot of like the mythos that's out there, is a book by a guest that we've had on this program and also on TMBS, Matt Karp, um, called "This Vast Southern Empire," which I don't know if you've read before,
Mhm.
Matt, but if you
Yes.
haven't, yeah, it's excellent. And it makes the argument, for example, that like despite like the kind of like what's the famous Jefferson Davis quote that like all we ask is to be left alone. Completely false, right?
Yeah.
The planter slave owning class in the South had grand ambitions, for not just the preservation of slavery in the South, but actually the expansion of that system. That's why they were defending the slave system in Brazil. That's why they were defending the slave system in the Caribbean. That's why they were defending the slave system in Texas, right? This is old as hell. And on top of all of that, the concept of whiteness, right, which I think sometimes too, on like the liberal left, people have gotten a bit confused about, right, is also a very modern invention, right?
Mhm.
Because for a long time, for example, like the Greeks and the Romans were not, they were sun people, right? To use Charles Murray's
Yes.
terms, right? Right. These sun peoples and ice peoples that these racists love to talk about, right? For a long time, oh, the Greeks are barbaric, the Italians are barbaric. And it was a project of the 1800s in Germany, to start to consider the Greeks and the Romans, to actually be white. Right.
Right.
So like this concept, the way that they try to present it, like, well, this is Western civilization. These civilizations that they always want to point to, the Greek and the Roman traditions, were treated as Asiatic, right? To use like an old school term for these kind of things. Something outside of the European tradition, right? It
Mhm.
was a modern project to try to defend the hierarchies and the systems in place today. And you're seeing the same kind of, like, if they wanted to use anthropology and history and antiquity, in the 1800s, early 20th century, to defend like the systems you had in America, in England, in Germany, etc., right? You're seeing the same thing with the Sam Harris and these folks trying to use bunk science like IQ to try to defend, systems of exploitation, like capitalism today, right? It's the
Yep.
same old argument, that is just finding new clothes for it.
Yeah. And I just gotta say, like, that's why, like, it is, and I appreciate Hitchens relishing that conversation and wishing that it was more of an opportunity to talk about like the race and class, formation of an underclass through class oppression. Like, you know, um, and I think that's like how we have to think about, because like a lot of like the liberal side of things, like I sometimes think when the right finds these issues, I think they're doing it on like the weakness of the liberals, saying like, well, maybe they actually believe Charles Murray might have something, or maybe like they believe, like, I mean, we see this on the trans issue. I think people are afraid like, oh, maybe they're right about this, and they're not. And I do think like that's why it's important to be more Hitchensian and be like, yeah, let's fucking have that conversation.
Yeah. No, because they thrive in it. I mean, yeah, I think you're right that like they basically say we're the only ones willing to have this conversation. Therefore, there's a grand conspiracy to silence us on these things.
Yeah, and like that ends up being like the real conversation that we're having. It's just like the conversation that no one wants to let us have, and it's like, well, like, okay, no, we're letting you have this fucking conversation about naturalizing like discrepancies in your fucking made up metric. Like, it's bullshit. Like, and that's the response that needs to be have. And like, well, it shouldn't be, I guess, that big of a surprise that a capitalist media isn't the most adept at dealing with the class component of that.
I think that the point that Hitchens made in that Nation column too, Matt. I just want to like re-up it one more time.
Mhm.
Um, that like in the long term of like human evolution, right?
Yes.
Like let's be scientific about this. The difference, in society, in like human beings, like from 2020 and people living, 2000 BC, it's just not long enough for there to
Yeah.
be these grand differences in human biology, right, and in genetics, that these people try to fixate on it and hold on to. It's just scientifically illiterate to talk about things like that. Um,
Yeah.
Evolution is a very, very slow process. It's not something that like each generation, is sort of like transporting itself, into something that is just unrecognizable or so foreign or different, from each other. And like, you can see this, in medical science today, that like, these divisions that I think are very important, kind of maybe like culturally and politically, because of like the role of, particularly like today, because of like the scientific racism that's like developed in like the 1800s, right? And these things have real effects on people in the sense of like what it means for a person living in society today. But there's just not enough time for these things to actually develop, right? So like even just like trying to entertain the thesis for a second, I think that the point that Hitchens makes there, and it's not unique to him, people make this point all the time, it's just
Right.
scientifically illiterate to sit here and say that like, oh, this culture, this nation has like a different genetic makeup than that culture, that civilization.
Yes, I mean, I'll read this quote again as I'm uploading a thing, but it was there is no gene for IQ, and there is no genetic or evolutionary timing that is short enough to explain histories or societies. And like that is the scientific point, right? Like that timing, you're not thinking clearly. And it just reminds me of this exchange Dawkins had with Brett Weinstein, where they're talking about, I think, World War II. And it's been a while since I played this clip, but I just want to throw this in here because I think Dawkins has to correct Brett and be like, let's just relax on trying to explain everything like this.
Very much so, yes.
The Second World War.
Yes.
Right? Even the terminology. You had the fatherland effectively raping Mother Russia. I mean, that's even the terminology, right? So what this was a lineage-level phenomenon in which a population went after two other populations, one that was internal to its borders or its near neighbors, and one population that was distant but had a great many resources. But the point is, understood from the perspective of German genes, vile as these behaviors were, they were completely comprehensible from the level of fitness. It was abhorrent and unacceptable, but understandable that Germany should have viewed its Jewish population as a source of resources. If you viewed Jews as non-people, then whatever resources they had could be appropriated for German genes. And likewise, the future of Germany lies in Russia. All of the resources of Russia. And how many million, is it 20 million Russians it took to turn the German war machine around? So what you have are these population against population conflicts. If you view it as group selection, it makes no sense. But if you view them as lineages, it makes a great deal of sense. And the belief structures that caused people to step onto battlefields and fight were clearly comprehensible as adaptations of the lineages in question.
Oh, my Lord.
I think nationalism might be an even greater evil than religion. And I'm not sure that it's actually very helpful to talk about it in Darwinian terms. I think it's perhaps this might be a case where we do need to defer a little bit to historians and non-biologists and think about it in other ways.
Yeah, so
It's like, like these are friendly folks, right? So like that's as close to a body slam as you're gonna get from Dawkins.
I mean,
That's
that long
amazing.
fucking preamble where Rich is like, he, like recoiling separate times, being like, can you let me get a word in? Specifically the words, no, let's not try to explain this through fucking lineage selection, like you fucking psycho. And like, and like, look, like that, no scientifically literate person is convinced by what Brett Weinstein is doing there. That was pure flimflammery. Like there were, to the point where there was nothing Dawkins could even say to kind of soften, like, no, let's defer to historians. You will not hear Richard Dawkins say that about very many topics.
That's very true. No, Richard Dawkins is somebody who said that like if an alien civilization ever discovers Earth, like they won't be interested in our Shakespeare's, our Marx's, our Aristotle's. They're going to be interested in Darwin, like the people who discovered scientific, discoveries, right? That's a big thing for Darwin, I mean, for Dawkins, to claim there. But it's like, I mean, because what Weinstein is saying again is like so insanely anti-scientific. Like the way he's trying to use Darwin, the way he's trying to use evolution there. I mean, what is the German people, right? This is not like a nation that has existed long enough to even like be considered, right? Like, hell, if we're saying like 4,000 or 5,000 years is like too short to be considered like as like a distinct group evolutionary, right? You're talking about something that like was non-existent until the 19th, 20th century, right? What the fuck are you going on about?
Yeah. I mean, look, like people need to know, like, it's very simple what happened there. Brett Weinstein is a charlatan. He
Yeah.
has no real,
And
like,
Dawkins sucks too, right? This is
Dawkins
like, it's
sucks as well.
amazing
Yes.
that like, yeah, no, totally. I mean, I'm
Right.
thankful for him saying what he said, right? Like, it gives me a lot more respect for him.
There's a difference. Like Dawkins actually, like Dawkins compared to Brett Weinstein, like it's not close who has actual scientific credentials.
Yeah.
Brett Weinstein is not in the same league, regardless of what their politics are. Like Brett's shit is he did a few things and then he was adjunct and then did a couple stunts, my opinion, which he explicitly said the trouble started when the union agreed to diversity stuff in their contract. Now, like he has since been rocketed to stardom based on that. I will point out he is the brother of a partner of Peter Thiel's, so that probably didn't hurt his rise. So like he doesn't have any actual expertise on and none of this shit. And I think that I don't know if there's a clear clip of. I mean, there's lots of clips of him being absolutely batshit crazy, but that one, I don't know if there's a more damning clip. Like if you show that clip to somebody who's a Weinstein fan and they don't think it is damning, they don't know shit about science.
Yeah. I know. I think it is really dangerous. I think sometimes it's important to sort of recognize the scope and like area that these people have influence over. I mean, maybe I'm just being rude here. I do think that Weinstein's like audience is like a very kind of like Reddit disaffected, strange character group of folks rather than being something that's like a leading voice in like the conservative movement, but it's congruous with the conservative movement. I mean, Murray is somebody who has been very influential, has been like a leader, somebody who is cited, somebody who's encouraged, to give testimony, to give advice on policy, right? So Murray is somebody, you should definitely know about if you don't know who that is.
And know how to deal with that, his arguments.
But they're doing the same thing, right? It just is a different kind of, I don't know, portrayal or performance of that same kind of old argument.
Yeah.
Oh man,
that's fun.
well, it's wild stuff. I mean, unless you had anything more on this, Matt.
No, I think that's good. I would recommend folks. I was going to play it, but I think it might be a little bit indulgent. But episode 20 of Chapo Trap House.
Is it long? I mean, you can do it.
Well, we'll just play a little bit. We'll be a little bit indulgent. This is them talking about Charles Murray. We won't play the part where he's involved in the Phoenix program, and but this is Charles Murray growing up.
The smarts idea of a smart person.
Yeah. Charles Murray he's lived a fascinating life. Charles Murray grew up in Iowa, where the angriest people in America live. As a boy, Charles burned a cross on a black neighbor's lawn, claiming he did not know of the racial animus behind this action. Charles later went on to publish studies linking race to IQ.
That's what he's.
So I just want to say, like, that is
Most
absurd.
crying
Like,
infants.
like fucking Iowa had the Klan. Like Iowa, I believe Dubuque, that part. I don't know what kind of labor did those the Mississippi River sort of connect like docks, but you might want to look into it. So like the idea I don't know what
Hill and the town he grew up in Iowa. I want to mention one other thing from Charles Murray's past before we get into this delightful little quiz he's concocted.
The Phoenix Project?
Yeah, no, in from 1965 to the early 70s, he was with basically this. It was something called the American Institutes for Research that was essentially a counterinsurgency program fronted by academics, by anthropologists in Thailand during the Vietnam War. And what they did was essentially use what they had studied and learned in the social sciences to better understand how to break manipulate and terrorize villages that they thought might go communist in rural Thailand, including things like using starvation, assassination, all kinds, but like with this kind of academic pseudo-psychological tilt about, the Asian villagers' minds and how best they could be broken and manipulated to serve U.S. policy in the region. And there's one other thing connected to this, and this was an article written in 1994 about Charles Murray when the bell curve was first breaking, and he became like a national figure because a lot of very wealthy right-wing people put a ton of money into promoting him and making him seem like some kind of, genius. This is an article. They mention his, the years he spent as a young man in Thailand. I'm quoting now from the New York Times article. What then took place in Bangkok? Quite a lot, it seems, since his friends from those days still tell tales of Murray's barroom antics, one that he nostalgically repeats. Murray explains that he and a Peace Corps friend once sat for 12 hours at a place called the Pat Pong Terrace, interviewing bar girls as they returned from their liaisons, taking, quote, all sorts of intimate notes about who did what that I don't care to repeat. The resulting document became an underground thriller among his friends. The article continues. Murray also makes clear that he did more than take notes, though he theatrically objects to hearing the women described as prostitutes. Don't use that word, he says. They were women of the evening, courtesans. We liked them, and they liked us. Murray continues. Wait, let me finish. Murray continues. In a lot of places, you had to woo the ladies, he continues. It involves money on the man's part, yes, but it also involves consensual relations.
Holy shit, dude, this is Carl Diggler talking.
Okay, yeah.
Pretty funny. No, that's
just,
the
I mean, yeah, and like the point, I guess the broader point besides being embarrassing is he's not a scientist. Murray has always been a think tank sort of gremlin and like sort of like a sort of mercenary, like a borderline intelligence asset. Like he's not a scientist at all. And like when Sam Harris, when he did that, I knew at the time, like, you fucking set yourself afire with this shit. Like, you can say like, oh, we should. No, this isn't like some guy trying to get his science published. It was a guy with a sort of political message that he was selectively using science to try to prove.
Mm-hmm. It's dark stuff, man. Well, happy to, try again to shed some light on this because unfortunately it's one of those things that you can debunk time and time again. And it seems to always come back. People have been challenging this stuff for a long ass time in this country. And I think it's important to not ignore it because they do thrive in like the sense of like, oh, this is the secret that they don't want you to tell, right? This is the truth that there's a coalition trying to block it, instead of the reality that this is just pseudoscientific nonsense. Has been debunked time and time again by people who understand genetics, by people who understand human biology, and is also just very, very clear, I think, from anyone who has a brain, that as Hitchens says, it's probably more likely that America has a genuine interest in creating an underclass, both racialized and class-based, so that it can use them to grease the wheels of this empire and this machine, to do labor, to make this, to make all the nice things that folks like Charles Murray get to enjoy. Versus the idea that, oh no, there's just a large segment of the population that is permanently sort of condemned to stupidity. So I think it's always worth it to sort of bring these things to the light of day and to challenge this nonsense, because it's dangerous, and like the social applications are very dangerous.